Es a la 1:30. Oh, yo juraba que era a la 1. A ver. Bueno amigos, aquí estamos, bienvenidos a otro episodio de DividendosTv. En este episodio vamos a ver la reacción del mercado en cuanto a la recorta de intereses por primera vez en 4 años de parte de la Reserva Federal aquí en Estados Unidos. Vamos a ver, yo espero no haber llegado tarde, pues me apuré bastante, pero posiblemente esté un poco tarde. Ya el mercado reaccionó bastante bien porque amaneció bastante. Ya anda casi rompiendo los récords anteriores. Vamos a ver aquí en WeBull a ver mejor. Wow, ya hizo un spike a 5.689. Esto era... es 18. Todavía, entonces sí es a la 1:30. O sea, para mí es a la 1:30. En el resto del mundo posiblemente es a las 2:30. Ok, un momentico. Ok, una cosa. Bro. Sí, ya pasó ya. Bueno, llegué tarde aquí a la fiesta, al parecer ya recortaron los intereses por 50 puntos y ninguna de estas páginas está en vivo. Esto es para el... Oh, man. No, ya esto aquí es para las preguntas y eso. Llegamos tarde a la decisión. Bueno, entonces ya esto lo decidieron y me imagino que va a ser ya 50 puntos. El mercado lo mismo subió y ahora está retrocediendo de nuevo. O sea, hay que ver qué pasa aquí. Llegó a un máximo de 5.689,75. Y habían dos cosas positivas y negativas acerca de cortar los intereses por 50 puntos. Era que ya al tomar la decisión de recortarlo por 50 puntos, prácticamente les deja decir a todo el mundo de que ellos están demasiado tarde para todo lo que ha pasado con la economía, en la falta de empleo. Hay muchas personas desempleadas. Bueno, hay que ver ahora a dónde va el SP500 de nuevo. me queda cantidad de ads. So, más o menos este es el statement de esta página washingtonpost.com. La Reserva Federal recortó las tasas de intereses por primera vez desde el comienzo de la pandemia, lo que redujo los costos de endeudamiento en medio punto, en una medida que debería brindar alivio a los hogares y las empresas que se encuentran bajo presión debido a las tasas elevadas. El enfoque más agresivo sugiere que los funcionarios están tratando de aliviar de manera proactiva la presión sobre la economía y evitar que el mercado laboral se desacelere aún más. La tasa de referencia ahora se sitúa entre el 4.75 y el 5%. La reunión de septiembre de la Reserva Federal es una de las más esperadas del año. La inflación ha ido disminuyendo hacia niveles normales y los líderes de la Reserva Federal esperan que esto continúe, pero también está bajo presión para asegurarse que las altas tasas no desaceleren el mercado laboral aún más de lo que ya lo han hecho. El presidente de la Reserva Federal, Jerome Powell, aparecerá en una conferencia de prensa donde se le presionará para que dé su diagnóstico sobre la economía, que es el que va a empezar ahora en unos minutos. Wow, yo quería ver el otro. Pero bueno, ya vimos la reacción del mercado. El mercado subió, y con lo mismo empezó a retroceder de nuevo. Vamos a ver ahora qué va a hacer. Si va a volver a subir a los niveles más altos o qué. Bueno, honestamente, nada se está moviendo. Nvidia más o menos ahí. Apple positivo 2.35%. Este es el VIX, que es la volatilidad. Saludos. Aquí intentando. Bueno, hoy la Reserva Federal cortó los intereses por 50 puntos. Eso va a aliviar algunas cosas en la economía, pero al mismo tiempo también va a dañar otras cosas en la economía. Mientras más bajen los intereses, más van a subir los precios de las casas, la renta, etc. Seguro. Para adelante, para atrás ni para coger impulso. Ya este video que nos queda aquí por ver es la conferencia que van a hacer después de la decisión. hacerlo dramático. Bueno, no mucho se ha movido. Wow. Home Depot para arriba. Bueno, por lo menos ya aquí alcanzamos 59.000. Esto es entre todas las cuentas. Estaba esperando hoy alcanzar 59.000 aquí en este portfolio, pero no sé si sucederá. Llegaremos a 59.000. Vamos a ver.
Good afternoon. My colleagues and I remain squarely focused on achieving our dual mandate goals of maximum employment and stable prices for the benefit of the American people. Our economy is strong overall and has made significant progress toward our goals over the past 2 years. The labor market has cooled from its formerly overheated state. Inflation has eased substantially from a peak of 7% to an estimated 2.2% as of August. We're committed to maintaining our economy's strength by supporting maximum employment and returning inflation to our 2% goal. Today, the Federal Open Market Committee decided to reduce the degree of policy restraint by lowering our policy interest rate by a half percentage point. This decision reflects our growing confidence that with an appropriate recalibration of our policy stance, strength in the labor market can be maintained in a context of moderate growth and inflation moving sustainably down to 2%. We also decided to continue to reduce our securities holdings. I will have more to say about monetary policy after briefly reviewing economic developments. Recent indicators suggest that economic activity has continued to expand at a solid pace. GDP rose at an annual rate of 2.2% in the first half of the year, and available data point to a roughly similar pace of growth this quarter. Growth of consumer spending has remained resilient, and investment in equipment and intangibles has picked up from its anemic pace last year. In the housing sector, investment fell back in the second quarter after rising strongly in the first. Improving supply conditions have supported resilient demand and the strong performance of the U.S. economy over the past year. In our summary of economic projections, committee participants generally expect GDP growth to remain solid, with a median projection of 2% over the next few years. In the labor market, conditions have continued to cool. Payroll job gains averaged 116,000 per month over the past 3 months, a notable step down from the pace seen earlier in the year. The unemployment rate has moved up, but remains low at 4.2%. Nominal wage growth has eased over the past year, and the jobs-to-workers gap has narrowed. Overall, a broad set of indicators suggests that conditions in the labor market are now less tight than just before the pandemic in 2019. The labor market is not a source of elevated inflationary pressures. The median projection for the unemployment rate in the SEP is 4.4% at the end of this year, 0.4 higher than projected in June. Inflation has eased notably over the past 2 years, but remains above our longer-run goal of 2%. Estimates based on the Consumer Price Index and other data indicate that total PCE prices rose 2.2% over the 12 months ending in August, and that excluding the volatile food and energy categories, core PCE prices rose 2.7%. Longer-term inflation expectations appear to remain well anchored, as reflected in a broad range of surveys of households, businesses, and forecasters, as well as measures from financial markets. The median projection in the SEP for total PCE inflation is 2.3% this year and 2.1% next year, somewhat lower than projected in June. Thereafter, the median projection is 2%. Our monetary policy actions are guided by our dual mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the American people. For much of the past 3 years, inflation ran well above our 2% goal, and labor market conditions were extremely tight. Our primary focus had been on bringing down inflation, and appropriately so. We are acutely aware that high inflation imposes significant hardship as it erodes purchasing power, especially for those least able to meet the higher costs of essentials like food, housing, and transportation. Our restrictive monetary policy has helped restore the balance between aggregate supply and demand, easing inflationary pressures and ensuring that inflation expectations remain well anchored. Our patient approach over the past year has paid dividends. Inflation is now much closer to our objective, and we have gained greater confidence that inflation is moving sustainably toward 2%. As inflation has declined and the labor market has cooled, the upside risks to inflation have diminished and the downside risks to employment have increased. We now see the risks to achieving our employment and inflation goals as roughly in balance, and we are attentive to the risks to both sides of our dual mandate. In light of the progress on inflation and the balance of risks, at today's meeting, the committee decided to lower the target range for the federal funds rate by a half percentage point to 4.75% to 5%. This recalibration of our policy stance will help maintain the strength of the economy and the labor market, and will continue to enable further progress on inflation as we begin the process of moving toward a more neutral stance. We are not on any preset course. We will continue to make our decisions meeting by meeting. We know that reducing policy restraint too quickly could hinder progress on inflation. At the same time, reducing restraint too slowly could unduly weaken economic activity and employment. In considering additional adjustments to the target range for the federal funds rate, the committee will carefully assess incoming data, the evolving outlook, and the balance of risks. In our SEP, FOMC participants wrote down their individual assessments of an appropriate path for the federal funds rate based on what each participant judges to be the most likely scenario going forward. If the economy evolves as expected, the median participant projects that the appropriate level of the federal funds rate will be 4.4% at the end of this year and 3.4% at the end of 2025. These median projections are lower than in June, consistent with the projections for lower inflation and higher unemployment, as well as the changed balance of risks. These projections, however, are not a committee plan or decision. As the economy evolves, monetary policy will adjust in order to best promote our maximum employment and price stability goals. If the economy remains solid and inflation persists, we can dial back policy restraint more slowly. If the labor market were to weaken unexpectedly or inflation were to fall more quickly than anticipated, we are prepared to respond. Policy is well positioned to deal with the risks and uncertainties that we face in pursuing both sides of our dual mandate. The Fed has been assigned two goals for monetary policy: maximum employment and stable prices. We remain committed to supporting maximum employment, bringing inflation back down to our 2% goal, and keeping longer-term inflation expectations well anchored. Our success in delivering on these goals matters to all Americans. We understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission. We at the Fed will do everything we can to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Steve Leisman, CNBC. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for taking our questions. In July, you said you weren't necessarily thinking about a 50. You didn't want to be specific, but you said you were thinking about a 50. The inflation data last week came out a little firmer than expected. Retail was strong, third quarter GDP running 3%. So what changed that made the committee go 50, and how do you respond to the concerns that perhaps it shows the Fed is more concerned about the labor market? And I guess, should we expect more 50s in the months ahead? And based on what should we make that call? Thank you.
So, okay, a lot of questions in here. Let me jump in. Since the last meeting, we have had a lot of data come in. We've had the two employment reports, July and August. We've also had two inflation reports, including one that came in during blackout. We had the QCEW report, which suggests that suggests that the payroll report numbers that we're getting may be artificially high and will be revised down. You know that. We've also seen anecdotal data like the Beige Book. And so we took all of those and we went into blackout and we thought about what to do, and we concluded that this was the right thing for the economy, for the people that we serve, and that's how we made our decision. So that's one question. What was the second and
How do
third?
we make this, sorry, thank you, sir. How do we figure out in the months ahead, is there another 25 or 50 coming in based on what shall we make that call? Thank you.
Sure. So, a couple things. A good place to start is the SEP, but let me start with what I said, which was that we're going to be making decisions meeting by meeting based on the incoming data, the evolving outlook, the balance of risks. If you look at the SEP, you'll see that it's a process of recalibrating our policy stance away from where we had it a year ago when inflation was high and unemployment low, to a place that's more appropriate given where we are now and where we expect to be. And that process will take place over time. There's nothing in the SEP that suggests the committee is in a rush to get this done. This process evolves over time. Of course, that's a projection, that's a baseline projection. We know, as I mentioned in my remarks, that the actual things that we do will depend on the way the economy evolves. We can go quicker if that's appropriate, we can go slower if that's appropriate, we can pause if that's appropriate. But that's what we're contemplating. Again, I would point you to the SEP as just an assessment of where of what the committee is thinking today, but the individual members, rather, of the committee are thinking today, assuming that their particular forecasts are realized.
Good, Chris.
Hi, Chris Rugaber, Associated Press. Thank you. The projections show that the Fed officials expect the Fed funds rate to still be above their estimate of long-run neutral by the end of next year. So does that suggest you see rates as restrictive for that entire period? Does that threaten the weakening of the job market that you said you'd like to avoid? Or does it suggest that maybe people see the short-run neutral as a little bit higher? Thank you.
I think the way I would really characterize it is this. I think people write down their estimate, individuals do. I think every single person on the committee, if you ask them what's your level of certainty around that, they would say there's a wide range where that could fall. So I think we don't know. There are model-based approaches and empirically based approaches that estimate what the neutral rate will be at any given time. But realistically, we know it by its works. So that leaves us in a place where we expect, in the base case, to be continuing to remove restriction, and we'll be looking at the way the economy reacts to that, and that'll be guiding us in our thinking about the question that we're asking at every meeting, which is our policy stance the appropriate one? We know, if you go back, we know that the policy stance we adopted in July of 2023 came at a time when unemployment was 3.5% and inflation was 4.2%. Today, unemployment is up to 4.2% and inflation's down to a few tenths above 2. So we know that it is time to recalibrate our policy to something that is more appropriate given the progress on inflation and on employment moving to a more sustainable level. So the balance of risks are now even, and this is the beginning of that process. I mentioned the direction of which is toward a sense of neutral, and we'll move as fast or as slow as we think is appropriate in real time. But what you have is our individual accumulation of individual estimates of what that will be in the base case.
Howard.
Howard Schneider with Reuters. How close was this in terms of the decision? You do have the first dissent by a governor since 2005, I think. Was the weight clearly in favor of a 50, or was this a very close decision?
I think we had a good discussion. If you go back, I talked about this at Jackson Hole, but I didn't address the question of the size of the cut, left it open. And I think we left it open going into blackout. And so there was a lot of discussion back and forth, good diversity of division, excellent discussion today. I think there was also broad support for the decision that the committee voted on. So I would add that look at the SEP. All 19 of the participants wrote down multiple cuts this year. All 19. That's a big change from June, right? 7 of them wrote down 3 or more, and 17 of the 19 wrote down 3 or more cuts, and 10 of the 19 wrote down 4 or more cuts. So, there is a dissent, and there's a range of views, but there's actually a lot of common ground as well.
Follow up to that, now that this is in the books, can you give us some guidance as sort of follow up to Steve on the pacing here? Would you expect this to be running every other meeting once we get into next year? For
Yeah,
example?
we're gonna take it meeting by meeting. As I mentioned, there's no sense that the committee feels it's in a rush to do this. We made a good, strong start to this, and that's really, frankly, a sign of our confidence. Confidence that inflation is coming down toward 2% on a sustainable basis. That gives us the ability. We can, make a good, strong start, but and I'm very pleased that we did. To me, the logic of this, both from an economic standpoint and also from a risk management standpoint, was clear. But I think we're going to go carefully, meeting by meeting, and make our decisions as we go.
Gina.
Hi, Chair Powell. Gina Smiley with the New York Times. Thanks for taking our questions. You and your colleagues in your economic projections today see the unemployment rate climbing to 4.4% and staying there. Obviously, historically, when the unemployment rate climbs that much over a relatively short period of time, it doesn't typically just stop. It continues increasing. And so I wonder if you can walk us through why you see the labor market stabilizing, sort of what's the mechanism there, and what do you see as the risks?
So, again, the labor market is actually in a solid condition. And our intention with our policy move today is to keep it there. You can say that about the whole economy. The U.S. economy is in good shape. It's growing at a solid pace. Inflation is coming down. The labor market is in a strong pace. We want to keep it there. That's what we're doing.
Sorry, Nick.
Nick Generoso, the Wall Street Journal. Chair Powell, does today's action constitute a catch-up in action given recent substantial revisions to the employment data? Or is this larger than typical rate cut a function of the elevated nominal level of the policy rate such that an accelerated cadence could be expected to continue?
Okay. Multiple questions in there. So I would say we don't think we're behind. We do not think we think this is timely. But I think you can take this as a sign of our commitment not to get behind. So it's a strong move. So your other question was?
Well, is this about what happened in the employment data between this meeting and the last meeting, or is this about the level of the funds rate, the high nominal level of the funds rate relative to what might be expected if you're trying to maintain equilibrium?
So I think it's about, we come into this with a policy position that was put in place, as you know, I mentioned in July of 2023, which was a time of high inflation and very low unemployment. We've been very patient about reducing the policy rate. We've waited. Other central banks around the world have cut, many of them several times. We've waited, and I think that patience has really paid dividends in the form of our confidence that inflation is moving sustainably under 2%. So I think that is what enables us to take this strong move today. I do not think that anyone should look at this and say, oh, this is the new pace. You have to think about it in terms of the base case. Of course, what happens will happen. So in the base case, what you see is, look at the SEP. You see cuts moving along. The sense of this is we're recalibrating policy down over time to a more neutral level. And we're moving at the pace that we think is appropriate given developments in the economy in the base case. The economy can develop in a way that would cause us to go faster or slower, but that's what the base case says.
And if I could follow up on that. In 2019, when you did the mid-cycle adjustment, you ceased the balance sheet runoff. With a larger cut today, should there be any signal inferred about how the committee would approach end state on the balance sheet policy?
So in the current situation, reserves have really been stable. They haven't come down. So reserves are still abundant and expected to remain so for some time. As you know, the shrinkage in our balance sheet has really come out of the overnight RRP. So I think what that tells you is we're not thinking about stopping runoff because of this at all. We know that these two things can happen side by side. In a sense, they're both a form of normalization. And so for a time, you can have the balance sheet shrink, but also be cutting rates.
Holly.
Thank you, Colby Smith with the Financial Times. Just following up on Gina's question on rising unemployment, is it your view that this is just a function of a normalizing labor market amid improved supply, or is there anything to suggest that something more concerning perhaps is taking place here, given that other metrics of labor demand have softened too? And I guess in direct follow-up to Gina is, why should we not expect a further deterioration in labor market conditions if policy is still restrictive?
So I think what we're seeing is clearly labor market conditions have cooled off by any measure, as I talked about in Jackson Hole. And but they're still at a level. The level of those conditions is actually pretty close to what I would call maximum employment. So you're close to mandate, maybe at mandate on that. So what's driving it? Clearly, payroll job creation has moved down over the last few months, and this bears watching. By many other measures, the labor market has returned to or below 2019 levels, which was a very good, strong labor market, but this is more sort of 2018-17. So the labor market bears close watching, and we'll be giving it that. But ultimately, we believe, with an appropriate recalibration of our policy, that we can continue to see the economy growing, and that will support the labor market. In the meantime, if you look at the growth in economic activity data, the retail sales data that we just got, second quarter GDP, all of this indicates an economy that is still growing at a solid pace. So that should also support the labor market over time. So, but again, it bears watching, and we're watching.
And just on the point about starting to see rising layoffs, if that were to happen, wouldn't the committee already be too late in terms of avoiding a recession?
So our plan, of course, has been to begin to recalibrate, and we're not seeing rising claims, we're not seeing rising layoffs, we're not seeing that, and we're not hearing that from companies that that's something that's getting ready to happen. So we're not waiting for that, because there is thinking that the time to support the labor market is when it's strong, and not when you begin to see the layoffs. There's some lore on that. So that's the situation we're in. We have, in fact, begun the cutting cycle now, and we'll be watching, and that'll be one of the factors that we consider. Of course, we're going to look at the totality of the data as we make these decisions meeting by meeting.
Michael McKee with Bloomberg TV and Radio. To follow up on that, what would constitute for you and the committee a deterioration in the labor market? You're pricing in basically by the end of next year 200 basis points of cuts just to maintain a higher unemployment rate. Would you be moving to a more preemptive monetary policy style rather than, as you did with inflation, waiting until the data gave you a signal?
We're going to be watching all of the data, right? So if as I mentioned in my remarks, if the labor market were to slow unexpectedly, then we have the ability to react to that by cutting faster. We're also going to be looking at our other mandate, though. We have greater confidence now that inflation is moving down to 2%, but at the same time, our plan is that we will be at 2%, over time. So. And policy, we think, is still restrictive, so that should still be happening.
I'm just curious as to how sensitive you'll be to the labor market, since you forecast we are going to see higher unemployment, and it is going to take a significant amount of monetary easing to just maintain it.
So, what I would say is we don't think we need to see further loosening in labor market conditions to get inflation down to 2%. But we have a dual mandate, and I think you can take this whole action as take a step back. What have we been trying to achieve? We're trying to achieve a situation where we restore price stability without the kind of painful increase in unemployment that has come sometimes with disinflation. That's what we're trying to do. And I think you can take today's action as a sign of our strong commitment to achieve that goal.
Rachel.
Hi, Chair Powell. Rachel Siegel from the Washington Post. Thanks for taking our questions. You're describing this view that you don't think you're behind when it comes to the job market. Can you walk us through the specific data points that you found to be most helpful in the discussions at this meeting? You mentioned a couple, but would you be able to walk us through what that dashboard told you as far as what you know about the job market now?
Sure. So we'll start with unemployment, which is the single most important one probably. You're at 4.2%. That's, I know that's higher than we were used to seeing numbers in the mid and even below mid threes last year. But if you look back over the sweep of the years, that's a very healthy unemployment rate. And anything in the low fours is a good labor market. So that's one thing. Participation is at high levels. It's, we're right adjusted for demographics, for aging. Participation's at pretty high levels. That's a good thing. Wages are still a bit above what would be their wage increases, rather, are still just a bit above where they would be over the very longer term to be consistent with 2% inflation, but they're very much coming down to what that sustainable level is, so we feel good about that. Vacancies over, per unemployed is back to what's still a very strong level. It's not as high as it was. That number reached 2 to 1, 2 vacancies for every unemployed person. As measured, it's now around 1. That's still a very good number, I would say. Quits have come back down to normal levels. I mean, I could go on and on. There are many employment indicators. What do they say? They say this is still a solid labor market. The question isn't the level. The question is that there has been change, particularly over the last few months. And so what we say is, as the risks, the upside risks to inflation have really come down, the downside risks to employment have increased. And because we have been patient and held our fire on cutting while inflation has come down, I think we're now in a very good position to manage the risks to both of our goals.
And what do you expect to learn between now and November that will help inform the scale of the cut at the next meeting?
More data, the usual. Don't look for anything else. We'll see another labor report. We'll see another jobs report. I think we get a second jobs report on the day of the meeting, I think. On the Friday before the meeting. And inflation data. We'll get all this data. We'll be watching. It's always a question of look at the incoming data and ask what are the implications of that data for the evolving outlook and the balance of risks, and then go through our process and think what's the right thing to do. Is policy where we want it to be to foster the achievement of our goals over time? So that's what it is, and that's what we'll be doing.
Yeah.
Hi, Chair Powell. Neil Irwin with Axios. We've only been running a little above 100,000 jobs a month on payroll the last 3 months. Do you view that level of job creation as worrying or alarming, or would you be content if we were to kind of stick at that level? And relatedly, one of the welcome trends of the last couple of years has been labor market steam coming out through job openings falling rather than job losses. Do you think that trend has further to run, or do you see risk that further labor market cooling will have to come through job losses?
So on the job creation, it depends on the inflows, right? So if you're having millions of people come into the labor force, and you're creating 100,000 jobs, you're going to see unemployment go up. So it really depends on what's the trend underlying the volatility of people coming into the country. We understand there's been quite an influx across the borders, and that has actually been one of the things that's allowed the unemployment rate to rise. And the other thing is just the slower hiring rate, which is something we also watch carefully. So it does depend on what's happening on the supply side. And on the beverage curve question, yes. So we all felt on the committee, not all, but I think everyone on the committee felt that job openings were so elevated that they could fall a long way before you hit the part of the curve where job openings turned into higher unemployment, job loss. And yes, I think we are. It's hard to know that you can't know these things with great precision, but certainly it appears that we're very close to that point, if not at it, so that further declines in job openings will translate more directly into unemployment. But it's been a great ride down. I mean, we've seen a lot of tightness come out of the labor market in that form without it resulting in lower employment.
Thanks, Chip. Edward Lawrence with Fox Business. So we've heard some speculation that you may be going with the federal funds rate to 3.5%, maybe under 4%. And there's basically an entire generation that has experienced zero or near zero federal funds rate. Now some think we're heading in that direction again. What's the likelihood that cheap money is now the norm?
So this is a question, and you mean after we get through all of this? It's just a great question that we can only speculate about. Intuitively, many people anyway would say we're probably not going back to that era where there were trillions of dollars of sovereign bonds trading at negative rates, long-term bonds trading at negative rates. And it looked like the neutral rate might even be negative. So there was people were issuing debt at negative rates. It seems that's so far away now. My own sense is that we're not going back to that. But honestly, we're going to find out. But it feels to me that the neutral rate is probably significantly higher than it was back then. How high is it? I just don't think we know. We only know it by its works.
One more. How do you respond to the criticism that will likely come that a deeper rate cut now before the election has some political motivations?
Yeah, so this is my fourth presidential election at the Fed, and it's always the same. We're always going into this meeting in particular and asking what's the right thing to do for the people we serve, and we do that, and we make a decision as a group, and then we announce it, and that's always what it is. It's never about anything else. Nothing else is discussed, and I would also point out that the things that we do really affect economic conditions for the most part with a lag. So nonetheless, this is what we do. Our job is to support the economy on behalf of the American people, and if we get it right, this will benefit the American people significantly. So this really concentrates the mind, and it's something we all take very, very seriously. We don't put up any other filters. I think if you start doing that, I don't know where you stop, and so we just don't do that.
Jolene.
Thank you, Chair Powell. I'm Jolene Kent with CBS News. My first question is, very simply, what message are you trying to send American consumers, the American people, with this unusually large rate cut?
I would just say that the U.S. economy is in a good place, and our decision today is designed to keep it there. More specifically, the economy is growing at a solid pace. Inflation is coming down closer to our 2% objective over time, and the labor market is still in solid shape. So our intention is really to maintain the strength that we currently see in the U.S. economy, and we'll do that by returning rates from their high level, which has really been the purpose of which has been to get inflation under control. We're going to move those down over time to a more normal level over time.
Just a quick follow-up to that. Listening to you talk about inflation moving meaningfully down to 2%, is the Federal Reserve effectively declaring a decisive victory over inflation and rising prices?
No, we're not. So inflation, what we say is we want inflation, the goal is to have inflation move down to 2% on a sustainable basis. And, we're close, but we're not really at 2%. And I think we're going to want to see it be, around 2% and close to 2% for some time. But we're certainly not we're not saying mission accomplished or anything like that. But I have to say, though, we're encouraged by the progress that we have made.
Hi, Katerina Saraiva with Bloomberg News. I just would love to know kind of how the committee is thinking about the persistence we've seen in housing inflation. Do you think you can return to 2% with housing inflation where it is? Yeah.
So housing inflation is the one piece that is kind of dragging a bit, if I can say. We know that market rents are doing what we would want them to do, which is to be moving up at relatively low levels, but they're not rolling over. The leases that are rolling over are not coming down as much, and OER is coming in high. So, it's been slower than we expected. I think we now understand that it's going to take some time for those lower market rents to get into this, but the direction of travel is clear, and as long as market rents remain, relatively low inflation, over time that will show up. Just the time it's taking now, several years rather than just 1 or 2 cycles of annual lease renewals. So that's, I think we understand that now, but I don't think the outcome is in doubt. Again, as long as market rents remain under control, the outcome is not in doubt. So I would say it's the rest of the portfolio, or of the elements that go into core PCE inflation have behaved pretty well. You know, they all have some volatility. We will get down to 2% inflation, I believe, and I believe that ultimately we'll get what we need to get out of the housing services piece too.
Some of your colleagues have expressed concern that with starting to cut rates, you could reignite demand in housing and see prices go up even more. You know, what's the likelihood of that, and how would you react to that?
The housing market, it's hard to game that out. The housing market is in part frozen because of lock-in with low rates. People don't want to sell their home, so because they have a very low mortgage, it'd be quite expensive to refinance. As rates come down, people will start to move more, and that's probably beginning to happen already. But remember, when that happens, you've got a seller, but you've also got a new buyer in many cases. So it's not obvious how much additional demand that would make. I mean, the real issue with housing is that we have had and are on track to continue to have not enough housing. And so it's going to be challenging. It's hard to find, to zone lots that are in places where people want to live. It's all of the aspects of housing are more and more difficult. And where are we going to get the supply? This is not something that the Fed can really fix. But I think as we normalize rates, you'll see the housing market normalize. And I mean, ultimately, by getting inflation broadly down, and getting those rates normalized, and getting the housing cycle normalized, that's the best thing we can do for householders. And then the supply question will have to be dealt with by the market and also by government.
Victoria.
Hi, Victoria Guido with Politico. Just following up on some of the labor market talk earlier, monetary policy operates with long and variable lags, and I'm wondering how much you see being able to keep the unemployment rate from raising too much comes from the fact that you're starting to act now, and that's going to give people more room to run, versus just the labor market is strong. And then also, if I could, following up on Nick's question, do you see today's 50 basis point move as partially a response to the fact that you didn't cut in July, and that sort of gets you to the same place?
So you're right about lags, but I would just point to the overall economy. You have an economy that is growing at a solid pace. If you look at forecasters or talk to companies, they'll say that they think 2025 should be a good year too. So there's no sense that the U.S. economy is basically fine. If you talk to market participants, I mean, business people who are actually out there doing business. So I think our move is timely. I do, and as I said, you can see our 50 basis point move as a commitment to make sure that we don't fall behind. So you're really asking about your second question. You're asking about July, and I guess if you ask, if we'd gotten the July report.
Ok, señores, por mucho que me quisiera quedar, todavía tengo trabajo y tengo que entrar al trabajo en 52 minutos. Gracias a Dios vivo cerca del trabajo, a 7 minutos. Pero bueno, todavía necesito prepararme la comida, bañarme y entonces salir a trabajar. Y bueno, nada, como decía aquí en el chat, normalmente por las estadísticas septiembre es uno de los peores meses, si no el peor mes que hay para las inversiones en el mercado, tiende a bajar mucho. Las últimas 2 semanas en septiembre son peores todavía. Y también según las estadísticas, si con hacer una búsqueda pequeña en internet, ven que cada vez que hacen un recorte de intereses el mercado tiende a bajar. Todavía no se puede cantar victoria antes de tiempo, que es lo que va a suceder en el mercado por lo menos. Pero todavía hay que esperar a ver cómo se acomoda. Estamos aquí, prácticamente el mercado formó otro techo, otra resistencia. Tenemos 3, puede ser 1 o que decida bajar completamente hasta los niveles estos de 5.000 o hasta más todavía, aquí a 4.900, pero no se sabe todavía. O puede ser que tomen la decisión de el recorte de intereses como algo positivo. Por sí o por no, siempre hay que tener tremendo cuidado con esto porque es un arma de doble filo. Como hemos estado hablando en el chat, lo malo aquí es el thank you Nick. Lo malo aquí es la tasa de desempleo que ha estado creciendo y creciendo y creciendo. Y para la Reserva Federal, y lo que contribuye más a una recesión es el desempleo, no la inflación, aunque los dos van de la mano, pero ellos están más interesados en el desempleo que la inflación. La inflación está bajando, el desempleo está creciendo. Está tratando de hacer todo lo posible para que tengamos un soft landing, lo que le dicen en inglés, un aterrizaje, no sé cómo ponerlo, más fácil, sin tener que ir a una recesión o una pequeña recesión. Posiblemente salgan en 6 meses y digan que estábamos ya en una recesión, porque normalmente la recesión, cuando la dicen, ya han pasado de 4 o 6 meses, so hay que esperar. Pero bueno, nada, entonces yo lo que estaba esperando era a ver si el portfolio mío alcanzaba unos récords más altos, y bueno, sí lo alcanzó por un segundo, alcanzó 59.000 aquí. Quiere decir que en esta página fuese porque aquí están todas mis cuentas. Aquí adicionalmente hay 2 cuentas adicionales. Aquí solamente hay las que yo tengo normal. Eso quiere decir que aquí esto tuviese más ahora. Debería estar más. Pero bueno, sí tocamos los 59.000 por primera vez y tocó y bajó. Pero bueno, hay que esperar. Hay que esperar a ver qué es lo que pasa dentro de... Vamos a ver los últimos 2 días de la semana, jueves y viernes, cómo reacciona el mercado a las noticias. También, por supuesto, al el mercado llegar a este nivel tan alto de nuevo, la mayoría de los inversores lo que hacen es tomar profits, venden a los niveles más altos para coger los retornos positivos. Pero hay que ver qué es lo que se forma aquí. Aquí estamos volviendo a subir de nuevo, pero sí está formando como que un downtrend, no ha subido más de los 5.689. Eso fue un candle, una vela de esa que subió rápida. Y bueno, vamos a ver cómo termina el día y cómo termina la semana y el resto del mes. También, como dijimos en el chat, estamos en un año de elecciones, tantas cosas suceden una tras de la otra con la economía, que es una locura, es una tormenta, un tornado en el mundo de la economía por las elecciones. Empiezan a cambiar muchos patrones, muchas formas de hacer todo esto. Pero bueno, nada, gracias a todos por conectarse. Espero que tengan un buen día. Nos vemos en otro episodio, posiblemente el viernes en el viernes, que son las inversiones que yo hago regularmente. Siempre recuerden, invierte su dinero, compren la fábrica y no los productos. Nos vemos en un próximo episodio. Chao.